back. And that's how some people think. So in terms of trying to build this coalition that you're talking about, how do we get people to view the problem as a human problem and not something that, well, I don't have to worry about that because that doesn't affect me?
As an advocate, I had thought of my job as how do you persuade kind of those mainstream white voters to think differently? And much of advocacy has been geared towards, civil rights advocacy, I mean, has been geared towards how do we make that group of people think differently and care about our issues, our concerns, and our needs. Well, I think at this stage of movement building, my own view is that the first order of business is how can we get our communities to care about each other, right? That the first order of business is consciousness raising and developing a sense of care, compassion, and concern within the communities most affected by it before we really even begin to address kind of those mainstream white swing voters that we're ultimately going to have to persuade through our advocacy work. And I say this in part because one of the things that I've been really struck by in my own work on these issues is that, with Jim Crow, African Americans were stigmatized, but they had their own businesses, they had their own churches, theaters, workplaces. There was a sense of solidarity within the community. There was a degree of racial solidarity in community. Well, mass incarceration has turned the black community against itself, has turned communities of color against itself. And I think we first need to begin to build unity and a common understanding of the nature of this system and kind of an agreement about what must be done about it. Obviously there's not going to be perfect agreement or perfect consensus, but I think the first order of business is to raise consciousness in our own community that the fact that all these kids are going to jail is not because they're just all hoodlums or bad kids, right? It's because it's a setup. Their lives have been structured in such a way that guarantees their early admission into jail, and we need to begin to come together as a people and as a community to begin fighting for reform. I think it also means, like I said earlier, trying to eliminate the stigma. One of the things I thought was really interesting in some of this ethnographic research is the reluctance of so many people who have been labeled felons to admit it in church. That many people who have been branded felons won't go to church anymore because they feel they're not wanted there, that churches are a place where kind of the good people are supposed to go. And they feel branded and not welcome. Well, churches should be kind of the first place that people can come to get support and their families can find some measure of support. And I think there needs to be some community building and consciousness raising that happens even before we direct our attention to kind of those so-called mainstream white swing voters. So right now in my own work, I'm really interested in what can be done among formerly incarcerated people, their families, the communities that are most impacted by mass incarceration to organize and build kind of strength and solidarity within those communities.
What would you propose that the sentence be for someone who is accused of selling drugs and also in possession of a firearm when the purpose of the mandatory minimums when it comes to drugs and guns is to deter that from happening and deter the violence from taking place? For example, we know with people that sell drugs and carry a firearm is eventually to use it to either shooting take place or a homicide take place, since the rise in violent crime is as a result of drugs being sold in those neighborhoods. So what sentence, if any, would you recommend?
Well, I mean, I think if you're talking about a first-time offense for drug sales, I have to say that my mind is very open to drug legalization. I have not, there's a lot of research and conflicting arguments about, whether drug legalization makes communities safer or less safe and all of that. I haven't explored all of that research, but my mind is very open. And one thing is for sure is that, research indicates that much of drug violence, drug-related violence in inner-city communities is a result of drug markets being destabilized. That when you start arresting people and taking them off the street, then people fight to retain control of the drug markets and violence ensues, that some of the most peaceful drug markets to be found in the world are the ones that are left alone. Okay? So it's not clear to me that drug sales should be criminalized at all. But if it is criminalized, I think we can take a look at, some of what the other countries in the world did. In fact, in the United States, there wasn't until the drug war, nobody went to jail for more than a year for a first-time drug offense. Nobody. It was unheard of. In most countries in the world, even for drug dealing, you get maybe weeks or few months, not years. So, our perception of what's reasonable in terms of, sentences for drug convictions, I think, is just grossly distorted by the war on drugs. And, what's ironic, I think, is that, back in the 1970s, most criminologists, there was near consensus among criminologists that these theories of deterrence just didn't work. That the idea that you can deter somebody from committing a drug crime by telling them you're going to get 5 years rather than 1, people don't make those kinds of calculations in making decisions about whether to use or sell drugs. So, like I said, I think right now I'm more interested in kind of thinking about whether drugs should be legal at all. And at a minimum, I think we should go back to doing things the way we did before the war on drugs was declared. And back then, the longest sentence anybody got for a drug offense was measured in months rather than years. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with you about how improving the quality of education by itself would not end the over-incarceration problem, but I'm wondering the extent to which you believe other practices like zero tolerance, over-criminalization, police in schools actually come from the exact same impulse that result in the drug problems, and how much does that mean, therefore, that the solution does involve taking a careful look at those policies at the school level?
Yes. I agree completely, yes. I didn't mean to suggest that we shouldn't be concerned about what's happening in the schools at all, and I do think that the punitive impulse towards kids of color in urban schools stems from precisely kind of the same kinds of attitudes and inclinations that are found in the world. It's really just an extension of the drug war into our inner city schools. So, yes, I agree wholeheartedly. Thank you.
Thank you.